All right, welcome back to part 4 of this class on dark patterns in UX design. Let's soldier on and dive into the second part of the psychology behind UX design. We are going to kick things off part 4 here with talking about peer pressure. So what is peer pressure? Peer pressure is direct or indirect pressure from people that somebody knows and who have a similar social status to oneself, or that they perceive to have a similar social status to oneself. Things like television, movies, video games, etc. can exert peer pressure if viewers perceive themselves belonging to the displayed social group. So it's not just about actually belonging to a particular group, but it's about the groups that we think we should belong to, or the groups we think we do belong to. All of those can exert peer pressure on us, whether or not those groups actually exist or not. So there are different types of peer pressure. There's an active peer pressure type, which is this is when a person tries to convince someone to do something, actively working to present that. So for example, if you have two friends who are driving and then one says to the other, okay, go above the speed limit, everybody's doing it anyways, why don't you just go ahead and drive faster? That's an example of excuse me, active peer pressure. Passive peer pressure is modeled or mimicked behavior. So if somebody has a lot of friends that say text and drive, they may be more willing to text and drive themselves. And what's interesting is that although active peer pressure is more overt, studies show that passive peer pressure may have more influence on someone's behavior than active peer pressure. Peer pressure is not always negative. It can influence positive behaviors. For instance, research shows that teens with friends who volunteer are more likely to volunteer themselves. But as far as dark patterns are concerned, peer pressure is used mostly in what we call a social proof context. And that's to say, look, a lot of people are doing this, you should do it as well. And actually pressuring people to make a decision based off what everyone else is doing, regardless of whether or not the decision is actually good for them. Let's talk about scarcity. So when something is in short supply, we call it scarce and is perceived as having more value. We use an item's availability and perceived abundance to quickly estimate its quality or utility. So things that are more available or more abundant are usually deemed less quality, deemed to have less quality, or deemed to be less useful. Things that are less abundant deemed to have higher quality and more useful. This very easily leads to systemic errors and cognitive biases. So we also want to talk about the concept of new scarcity. So moving from a state of abundance to a state of scarcity. So if something is available everywhere, then all of a sudden it's not available at all or only available in small amounts. That's what new scarcity is. And when we have new scarcity, a great example of this is the cookie experiment. So this is a classic experiment that was done in psychology. So essentially what happened is that groups were given different amounts of cookies. So some groups in this particular study were given, I believe it was 10 cookies, and the other groups were 5, or it was 5 and 2, something along those lines. But one group had much more cookies than the other groups did. And then the groups were asked to rate the perceived value and tastiness of the cookies, just without knowing what the other groups had. What was interesting from this is that the groups that had fewer cookies rated those cookies as being more valuable and more tasty than groups that had more cookies. So that kind of shows the value and how the human mind perceives scarcity. The next step beyond that, though, was part of the experiment where they came into the groups and took away cookies. Particularly the group that had the fewer cookies to start off with. They took away cookies and they gave a couple of different explanations. They said that either the cookies themselves were being in high demand from other groups, so they gave them too many cookies. Since they have a few extra, they're going to take some from them and redistribute them to the group, or just simply that they made a mistake. Said, oh, we shouldn't have given you this many cookies to start off with. We're going to take a few away. Sorry about that. And what's interesting is the cookies out of all these different tests that were rated the most valuable and the tastiest were the ones in groups where cookies were taken away. So very interesting insight into how we perceive scarcity. If we perceive ourselves to be in competition with others, the value we assign to objects, especially scarce one, is even higher. So this all has to go back to the concept of perceived value, which is an important part of UX design and dark patterns. Things with higher perceived values, things that are more scarce, are going to be considered for us to be in competition. It's going to drive us to make decisions that we might not otherwise make. Let's talk about shame and guilt. So shame is an unpleasant shame is an unpleasant psychological emotion arising from a negative evaluation of oneself associated with powerlessness, worthlessness, and feelings of mistrust. Guilt is a cognitive or an emotional experience that occurs when a person believes or realizes, whether or not it's true, that they have compromised their own standards or moral values and have violated a universal moral standard and bear significant responsibility for that violation. Okay, so these are two very sort of technical explanations of what shame or guilt are. But as far as UX design is concerned, they're so closely related to each other that we kind of look at them in the same way. They're both used in similar ways against us in dark patterns, leveraging shame, leveraging guilt, and leveraging those feelings of worthlessness, of mistrust, of having broken a moral standard to get us to do something that we wouldn't normally otherwise do. Let's talk lastly about the center stage effect, which is something that we see in a few dark patterns. So when we're given a number of different choices, we prefer the one in the middle. So if you line up 3 or 5 products in a row, you will actually see that the ones that are most commonly chosen are the ones that are in the middle. There was a 2012 study from the University of Chester that actually did this. They took 5 products and put them either horizontally or vertically and asked people to select a product from the 5. And the results were that the products that were put in the middle were the ones that were more commonly selected, despite being very equal with the other products that were out there. Most respondents felt that the reasons why they selected those products in the middle is because they perceived to be as the most popular options. So there's an opportunity that popularity may actually have some influence on how we make our decisions there. So for our next class, we're going to jump into the type of dark patterns. We're going to look at some of the patterns themselves. We're going to understand how they work and how these social and psychological concepts we've just discussed play into the tricks that designers use to get us to make decisions that are against what we would normally do.